Preparing to stream. Okay, we should be live on YouTube. Welcome to the Data Visualization Society Fireside Chat. Today we're going to talk about data visualization style guidelines. So I'm Amy Cesal. I'm the moderator for this discussion. I'm a co-founder and board member of the Data Visualization Society. If you do not know, the Data Visualization Society was founded to serve as a professional home for those working across the discipline while leading others into this growing and dynamic field. We want to increase the visibility and value of data visualization to the general public. Our mission is to connect data visualizers across tech stacks, subject areas, and expertise. You can become a member at datavisualizationsociety.org. And if you are a general or a patron member, you can log into your Data Visualization Society account and you can submit questions for us to discuss during this fireside chat. So just log in and there's a fireside chat questions form and you can add things there and we will discuss them as they come up. So I'm going to let my panelists introduce themselves, starting with Alan Wilson.
Thanks, Amy. I'm Alan Wilson. I work at Adobe as a principal designer, and I love data visualization. Can't get away from it. In my time here at Adobe, I've worked a lot with our design systems, and creating guidelines around how we do our UI. And because most of my efforts focus on the Experience Cloud, which is our enterprise offering and has a lot of analytics tools, I do a lot of the data visualization guidelines. So that's why I'm here. Max, do you want to go next?
Yeah, so I'm Max Graze, and I'm a lead data visualization engineer at MURAL, which is a collaborative whiteboard tool. And they're pretty much like when I started at MURAL, I wanted to implement a style guide. So I've been going on a journey to kind of define how we should be using styles in data visualization. At MURAL, I also work on some like dashboards, NLP projects, and then on my own time, I research sensory data representations, which is kind of a passion of mine, and anything else related to data that ties to my interests. Okay, I'll pass it to John.
Thanks. Hi, everybody. I'm John Schwabish. I'm a senior fellow at the Urban Institute, which is a nonprofit research institution based in Washington, D.C. And I'm also host, I'm just going to go with host of the PolicyViz podcast. Back to Amy.
Yeah, so along with being part of the Data Visualization Society, I've also created a number of data visualization style guidelines myself for the Sunlight Foundation and for the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. So this is also a passion area of mine. And so we started sort of collaborating as some of the people who have worked on these weird niche style guidelines in the data viz field. And I'll let Max explain a little bit more about how we got here.
Yeah, so we actually all came together last year, I think in summer, before summer, and it was at a data wrapper book club, actually on John's book. And I was really interested in the style guide section because, as I said, I was in the process of making a style guide. And so I was wondering if anybody wanted to join like a style guide working group. And then I got really lucky, and Amy and Alan and John all wanted to join. And since then, we've been meeting about once every 2 weeks and talking about style guides where there's holes. And it's pretty easy for us to get conversation flowing and to fill up those hours way too quickly.
I will say we've also compiled some resources on datavizstyleguide.com. And so we have some resources here, as well as like if you want to be more involved, fill out the practitioner form, the research form. We have a list of examples of data visualization style guidelines, and you can add your own here if you have worked on a data visualization style guide that's public. It's also on the DVS website. The DVS hosts that. It's on our resources page as one of our many resources. So that's another place to find it too.
And our goal isn't just to talk about style guides, but as Amy was showing, to accumulate resources and also see where there's the biggest gaps and hopefully find ways to fill in those holes with like templates or tools or something, which is still in process, which is why we want more user input and research on data visualization style guides.
So I'm going to start out with our first question, which is, what is a data visualization style guide?
All right, I'll go.
This is how our meetings go, just so everybody knows, just so they're familiar with like, this is how it goes.
No, not at all. We all have opinions here. So at its core, a style guide is a lot like a brand guide, if you're familiar with those, right? You have a logo and you have some basic guidelines around how that logo should be used. The white space that it should have around it, the colors, the sizes it might get used in, and some of the accompanying brand elements, like what's your corporate font and things of that nature. A data viz style guide is different in that it covers, surprise, data visualization. And so it needs to address some of the questions people have when creating a data visualization. It's adjacent to brand guides because obviously you want your visualizations to reflect some of that corporate identity. And sometimes it can be connected to a design system, which is a systemization of styles, usually for product or at least website UI. Anything I missed, guys?
I mean, I think that sounds basically right. So I guess our the thing that we've been wrestling with is like, that's the overall definition. And then like, and maybe Amy, this was what you're about to ask, like, what do you put in it? And that is,
I was going to say that these are like very brand specific, right? So each organization sort of has their own brand. If you're just using Microsoft Power BI or Tableau, like it's going to look, your charts are going to look like that tool. And so it's an implementation of how your brand looks and feels in your data visualization for the organization. And I think it's really important that they are organization specific. This is not like best practices for everyone. This is how my particular organization thinks about and does data viz based on who we are, our audience, and what we want to convey. So back to John's question of what do you put in one of these?
Well, I'll share the first thing, one of the first pages of mine, which might be unconventional, but I decided to put in an information architecture setup because especially for dashboards, a lot of times people aren't sure how to organize information. And I figured at least if all of the information is organized in the same way, then the dashboards and data visualizations can be somewhat uniform. So I specified that, and I felt like with starting with kind of like an overview of it, then it would be easier to dive down because you already, or dive into it because you already see kind of like the different pieces that make up a visualization, or in this case, a dashboard.
We have that. We have a long list of things that, so there's like so back kind of to Amy's point of like, these are organization specific. We sort of have a list of things that like that we've seen because we have these sort of collections of style guides, and there's one on that website that Amy mentioned, so there's sort of like the universe of things, and then the question is for each individual organization, what do they need? So for example, like at the Urban Institute style guide, it really doesn't deal at all with techniques or styles around interactivity. So, you know, there's color and there's font, which seems to be sort of like the standard, like minimum that you need to have, but there aren't any techniques about like, how do we lay out, or what's our preferred way to lay out an interactive visualization? Even though we do a lot of that, it's just not in our style guide because it's a particular small team that's doing that. So they have their own sort of rules of thumb.
That makes sense. Whereas our teams that do data visualization are entirely dispersed throughout Mural. And so we need to have more of these larger overviews.
Yeah, I think those are really good things. One thing that I try and include when I create a style guide is some fundamentals about how data visualizations work. Because often, not always, but often the audience you're creating this guide for doesn't have a lot of data literacy. They may not be familiar with terms like a metric or a dimension. They may not know the difference between different types of scales. And they may really struggle to choose a chart that's appropriate for the question that they're trying to answer. And so data visualization style guide is an interesting tightrope walk between providing rules and educating people about kind of best practices and things to think about when creating a visualization. And depending on your org, you're going to lean further one way or the other.
No, go, John.
I was just saying, so this raises a sort of a practical question that I've had for a long time. So where do you put those, for lack of a better word, let's just call them rules, even though I think we probably all agree there aren't rules, but like where do those rules go? Because like, you don't want to turn your style guide into a data visualization textbook, because that's just overwhelming. And so do you put them at the front and then have more guidance around specific chart types, or do you have guidance around, like, do you just like sequester each piece? Like, here's how, like, what we want our bar charts to look like in our organization. And here are best practices around bar charts. And then here's what we do with pie charts. And here's what we do with maps, et cetera, et cetera. So I know we've been debating this for a while, but maybe useful for other people here too.
Yeah. So personally, I'm a grammar of graphics guy. And grammar of graphics is this discipline that explains visualizations through the lens of a grammar, where you just have very basic building blocks. And then you can assemble these building blocks in any number of configurations to generate any number of charts. It's almost limitless, right? However, I have had very little success in helping others understand how to create good visualizations with that as a foundation. What I've found a more useful lens to provide guidelines through is chart types. So here are best practices for a histogram or a line chart or a bar chart. And a lot of those guidelines are redundant, right? You're going to say a lot of the same things you say in one and another, but your audience is most likely using it as a reference. They're currently designing a histogram and they're just going to read this section on histogram. So if you don't have something in there, or at least a link to something in there, they're likely to miss it. And so not universal, but I do think the majority of the guidelines I create are oriented around specific chart types.
I think the answer is it depends, like so many other things in data viz, right? I think it depends who your audience is. There was a question about, do you create multiple style guidelines based on different audiences? And I think it depends on your organization, right? You're going to have some very practical people who just want to implement the thing. They don't care about why this works. They just need it to work now, and they're grabbing your colors, whatever, and they just want to go. They don't care about the why. And then there's people who you need to convince that this is why you're doing a thing. This is why these rules exist. And so having that information somewhere, because I've found both people usually exist in an organization.
And that's also to say that we can't, or we could probably give a list of things that could be included in a style guide, but it would depend on your organization of which is necessary or which needs more weight or the other, which is why it's also a difficult topic, because it is so customizable and really depends on context.
Right. I think that's why we haven't seen the like this is a template that everyone should use, that actually works well for every organization, because they're all a little bit different, and it really matters who is using it for what they need.
Yeah. Two other things I want to bring up as belonging in a style guide, or at least in most style guides, are you need to address accessibility, right? You need to make sure that your guidelines work for the people it needs to work for. And then tooling comes into play. Your guidelines are only useful if they have practical application in the tools that your audience is using. So knowing what tools your audience are using is one of the first things you should discover before creating a style guide, because that will guide a lot of how you structure your guidelines. If everyone you're designing a guideline for is using Excel and nothing but, then you're going to want to provide all the guidelines through the lens of that tool. If you need to support multiple tools, you're going to do it differently. But the key point I'm making here is that the guidelines provide, practical, tangible resources. So things like templates or design files that your audience can download and immediately start using and getting value from your system.
I want to add on to the part about accessibility, only because some people might wonder, well, the people in our organization who are making the visualizations aren't the ones that are putting it on the website, right? If it's a static visualization, or they're going in PDF reports, like those aren't the people who are writing that content. And the accessibility piece, and also anything around like language around groups or people or icons or whatever, is just important for everybody in the organization to be thinking about these issues. So it might not be the case that the data viz developer is writing the alt text for the graph on the blog, although I think we would probably all agree that they should. But even if they're not, at least so that they're aware that this is an aspect of the creation of the viz is part of the job. And even if they're not doing it, they're not involved in the day-to-day, they should just be aware that there is this consideration.
That's one of the great values of data visualization style guidelines, is that you can level up your organization in these ways, talking about things like accessibility, because it's just built into the process and it's part of how you think about creating charts at your organization. If I was just creating one bar chart, would I think about the alt text for it? Maybe not, but if it is part of the standard of how we do things, your charts get better because of that.
And I think that's the goal of a style guide, is to improve the quality of communication with data in your organization. And so everything needs to be looked at with that goal in mind. What can we do to make this better? And so again, back to the point that these are individualized based on your organization's needs. Those needs are going to emerge over time. Your first version of the style guide isn't going to be a silver bullet that you never have to revisit. You're going to release that and you're going to see people use it and misuse it. And then you're going to address the shortcomings of that style guide to make the output more useful. And if there's something in the style guide that just isn't affecting the output, then it probably isn't necessary.
Yeah, and even before you release it, I mean, as you're developing it, you should be talking to stakeholders that are going to use it, because I mean, imagine if somebody created this whole plan and guide for something that you've been doing for a few years and was just like, okay, now you have to do this because I'm the expert and I say this is the best way to do it. Well, it might not take into consideration either all of their capacities or how they do work. And so it's important to really see like how you can make those big changes, because if you just give this huge document that changes the way that people work, then they might not implement any of it. And so figuring out like what are the most important points and maybe having like an 80% there, then this is good tolerance, then that could be really helpful as well. But also in the beginning, just having everyone be in on the project so they feel like they're a part of it. They're a part of the change as well, and not that they're kind of like I don't want to say victim of it, but
Yeah, that sort of gets to the next submitted question, which is how do you measure alignment to style guide? And what are the best methods you found for measuring that alignment for charts that you produce back to the guide itself?
That's a really good question. And I mean, I hate to say it depends, but I guess it depends on the organization and just how the organization's structured. Like I can speak to the urban experience, like the way the urban experience works, at least for like the blog, is that we have a blog editing team that focuses on the message and the content and the text. And then there's a couple of us on the DataViz team, and our job is to make the graphs consistent with the style guide. So we are primarily making those graphs in Excel. So when we're using a tool like Excel, you can't necessarily like control everything the way you can in a coding language like R or D3 or something, where you could say, put this text box or this letter at pixel number, at this, this location, this pixel X versus pixel Y. It's a lot of still, manually moving things around. So I think, like, personally, the way I do it when I get a visualization is I have a printout of the main things in the graph that I need to make sure that are in the right spot. So like, a lot of it is text. Is the title in the right font, right bold, right size, in the right spot, right? Is the logo is at the bottom, but it gets aligned with the top of the source line, right? So I sort of like, sort of just move that across. And then the color. So it's not, I think if you found like 2 bar charts of ours that have gone out and had like the same number of data points on them and like match them up, there's probably be small differences, but that's like what happens when you use Excel. Like, I think that's just like part of it, but that's our workflow, and it works, but also like, who's doing that besides like people on this call? Like, who else is going to be doing that? Like, our readers would be like, okay, it's a bar chart, great, I see that this thing's going up, and then they move on to the next thing. So I think the advantage of the style guide, or one advantage of the style guide, is you lower the bar for everybody at the organization who is not on this call, who really could care less about the font and what color the bars are supposed to be. They just want to like make the graph and get it out. And you lower that barrier to making good looking stuff that is consistent with the organization.
Yeah, another thing I want to point out in this area is setting an expectation that the style guide is going to evolve and change. This is really challenging because people don't like that, but by its nature, it's going to change. It's going to evolve, and you might, set a rigid cadence. We're going to publish quarterly updates or annual updates, but no matter what, you need to set an expectation for change, because you are going to learn, and you should learn and adapt.
And that's why the templates that, Alan, you mentioned earlier are so valuable, right? Because again, except for everybody on this call, like, most people just want to make the thing, and they don't want to have to think about, does the title, what font and what size and where exactly does it go? They want to spend their time thinking about their data and their content. Maybe they want to think about, maybe a bar chart's not the right chart. I want to try something else, but they don't want to worry about all the little detail things. And maybe too many people think that that's more like a graphic design thing. And like, I'm not a designer, I'm a data person kind of thing. And so if you can have templates, I mean, certainly easier if you're like in a coding world, right? Because like in R, for example, we have an urban theme that's open source that people can go grab and tweak. I mean, that's just kind of easier in some ways. I'm going to hedge that just a little bit. Like, it's easier for like I'll just say this. It's easier to implement the style guide, the styles in a theme in like an R language or any programming language for people who know how to code in that language. But like our editorial team, who is, they're like editing and copy editing the titles and the labels on the charts, they're not expected to, they're not coders, nor should they be expected to be coders. So when you get to that, is like, are we now asking our editorial team to like learn R and how to code it and make changes? Like, no, we're not. Like, that's not something we're going to ask to do. So, there's challenges with all these different toolkits. I don't think there's like a singular answer to these. unless you are the person doing all of it, which is also not fair to that one person. So I don't think there's like a right or wrong answer here. It's just it's kind of complicated.
Yeah, one thing to add to that is the importance of defaults, right? You're getting, like, that's part of what templates do for you, is it reduces the friction toward the right thing, right? They're more likely to get it right than wrong when you provide really smart defaults through templates. And this came up a lot in the Outlier conference.
I also want to touch on the differences between a style guide and a template, because sometimes people think about them as the same thing. And so style guides are sort of the ideals that templates are working towards. If you just have templates, like John only works in Excel, and so he has templates for Excel, but if he limited Urban to just using Excel, there wouldn't be room for evolution there, right? So style guides are a place for other programs to sort of work towards this ideal. And no, they don't always get 100% there. That's not always possible, right? But it makes sure that your Excel, what comes out of Excel and Tableau and R and PowerPoint and Illustrator all sort of look the same, because they're all shooting for the same goal.
Yeah, and I would add on top of that, sort of blending a couple of things that we've been talking about on the idea of that things evolve. You know, when we first developed our style guide at Urban, when I first started, which was like 6 or 7 years ago, we were almost entirely for our reports and our blog Excel based. And over the last couple of years, we've seen a big growth in R usage. But the two templates, there's not a like perfect handoff between the two. If I give you two graphs that use the two templates, you would be able to see a difference. I don't know whether you'd be able to identify which one is which, but you'd be able to see a difference. And so that's one of the things that we're working on now as we rethink or redesign or revise it, is how do we take what are the aspects of these two tools where we can line them up sort of seamlessly, right? Because there are certain things that you can control in one tool, but not the other tool, and the other tool, but not the first tool. So how do we like pick out these things that we can line up, and we'll probably have to make some sacrifice on both tools to make sure these things, to like Amy's point, as you like led this thing off, when the graph comes out, it doesn't look like it was, it doesn't look like it was made, and it just look, it's seamless in how it looks by the different tools.
Yeah, and maybe it's good to think that you should, of course, like strive for perfection, knowing well that you're not going to get it, because the point of style guides isn't, I mean, this is at least my opinion, but it's not to have like your ideal perfect data visualization design, but it's to improve the process for other people so that they can create these visualizations a lot faster and have less choices to be made. So essentially, you're trying to like distill your knowledge and provide people who are making data visualizations with easy choices and best practices without having to study data visualization for a couple of years.
So that sort of leads into our next question about adoption. This is not a thing where if you build it, people will automatically use it. How do you get people in your organization to use the style guidelines that you've built?
I mean, as terrible as this, well, I don't know if it sounds terrible or not, but like you make it a requirement. Like stuff isn't going to go out from our organization unless it follows our branding guidelines, right? And like our DataViz branding guidelines, which to Alan's point earlier can be distinct from the branding guidelines, because too often you see branding guidelines where it's like, oh, the colors are great and they're rich and they look great, but then you like put them in a line chart and they just don't work. You just can't distinguish between the different encodings. So,
How do you make it a requirement?
I mean, so again, organization specific, but like the way Urban works is like when you put a report, there is a process, right? So you have the research, it gets written, and then it gets edited. And before it goes out, there's a series of steps you have to go through, right? And there's, there's basically gatekeepers, right, at each of these different steps. And some of those gatekeepers are sort of fact check based. Some of them are funder based. So like, did we meet the requirements of the funder? Some of them are, do they meet the philosophy of the organization? And then there's the communication side. Like, have we edited this thing, right? And so everything gets edited. And again, because we're striving for the highest quality and consistency in that quality. It's not that, I used to work in government, and like, it was government voice. It was not John Schwabish voice in a paper, right? It was government. At Urban, you can have your own voice, but it needs to be consistent in terms of the quality of the work. So yeah, I mean, that's also good and bad, right? Like, it's a funnel, so things sort of can slow down a little bit. But again, if you're striving for I would argue, if you're striving for high quality and striving for especially consistency, that's one way that you can go about it. Why, Max, do you think that, like, okay, so I'll just turn it back, like, other ideas of like how to enforce it?
I don't have great ideas. It's interesting because at my organization is the opposite. We don't have gatekeepers because we're just like dispersed teams who use different data visualization tools. They can use really whatever they want to get the job done. And so it's taken a lot of time for me to figure out our data visualization landscape, what tools are used where by which team. And I still haven't figured that out. But even if I do, there's no way that I would be able to manage all of the outputs from all of these different teams. So instead of trying to, I feel like I keep stressing this point, but instead of trying to get perfection, I'm just focusing on the areas that it really matters. Like dashboards, and especially maybe customer facing dashboards are the ones that get used the most. And even then it was difficult because I was the only data visualization at MURAL, and most people didn't even know what that meant. And a lot of people, okay, now I'm getting into another topic, but like a lot of these people who make data visualizations on their resume, they probably put that they know DataViz, or DataViz is one of their expertise. And so for me to be telling them like, this is the best way to do DataViz, it's a little prescriptive. And I've also been worrying that it's maybe not giving them enough credit or recognizing their own like data skills. But so anyways, I have to be very careful about the whole process, and especially find people within these teams that are influencers. So my strategy is mostly to go to influencers and people who use these specific tools and can like put in the color palette and like maybe make Loom videos to share to their team. Because if I just tried to share this Loom video to a team, nobody is going to really care. I come from like data platform, whereas they're in product. And so it's like, why should I listen to you? But if it comes from their supervisor, someone who has a lot of influence on them, then they're more likely to listen to them. And it also gives me support that I need. So that's long story short.
Yeah, I know we've already spent a lot of time on this one, but I do want to chime in with more of the "if you build it, they will come" approach. I don't think it's going to work every time, but I do think that that's what I'm looking for, right? I want a style guide that solves problems that people have. And if it solves problems, then people will want to use it because their life is better with it than it was without it. And you still need some, gatekeeping and other, requirements and incentives, just organizationally to ensure a certain, benchmark of quality. But if you're forcing something on a group of people that isn't providing value, is making their lives more difficult than it was before, then it's only a matter of time until that thing falls apart and, it just doesn't do the thing you needed it to do. And so I'm always looking toward that. I'm always looking for feedback. And again, that ties into why I want to always change it, because I'm always finding ways to make it better.
I think there's an education component around here that we've all sort of touched on, is like, it does not exist in a vacuum. People have to know about this thing in order to use it. And so having someone who's an evangelist for it, like we touch on this in training when people get onboarded. We run trainings that people can attend for best practices around data viz on a monthly basis, right? So how do we integrate it into workflows so that people know about it and it's just like the expectation that people use it? Because sometimes that policing part works where you are looking at every chart, but sometimes that's not possible, like in Max's organization. So I think the education bit can be woven into any organization, and really trying to tell people the benefits about this, how it helps them, how it's useful for them to make things easier. They don't have to make choices. A lot of choices are made for them. You can like start from this color palette and go from there, instead of trying to come up with 5 colors yourself every single time. So really trying to find how having a style guide and using it benefits them and their workflow.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of things that go into that, right? Like you need a compelling demo of some sort, right? You're probably going to want to have a meeting with, the groups of people that you want to use this and explain what it is and how it works, and then really like kind of sell them on it. Likewise, you want to have some sort of consulting arm, right? So when someone feels like they have an exception to the style guide, like they're like, I've got this use case that just doesn't fit and I can't follow your guidelines, have a meeting with them, hear them out. You may be able to teach them something that will help them. They might be able to show you where your style guides are falling short and you can make some improvements.
That sort of touches on our next question, which is about usability. Do you have suggestions for usability testing? Should this be something that's built into the guidelines or having as a resource?
Are you talking about chart interactivity, that sort of usability?
Usability testing for the data visualization. Yeah.
I think there's 2 arms of that, right? One is interaction, like how do people interact and use the visualization? Like what do you do if you hover over this, and what happens if you click on this or tab onto this? Interaction layers on a huge set of complexity on our side to solve, but it provides a lot of advantage to the end user. Especially in the accessibility department because they can access it. But as far as testing that stuff, boy, there's definitely some best practices and things. Use it yourself is something I always advise. And then I let the people that are actually going to use it, watch them, use it. It's like there's nothing super unique about it. It's just observing and noting the areas where people are getting confused or they're not understanding something or not discovering something that you would expected them to understand or discover.
Yeah, I think it's a big lift for people to I don't know if it's a big, in my experience, it's been a big lift for people to actually give that feedback, right? Because it's another thing that they have to do, right? And like, if you, I guess only if you can make it such that, I don't know, like it's hard for people are limited in their time, right? And so for them they're making something, they're applying the styles, maybe they're using your R theme or your Excel thing or whatever tool you use, they're using your template and something doesn't work quite right. Maybe they shoot you a note, maybe they tell you this thing doesn't work, or maybe they're just like, forget it, I'm just going to fix it manually because I got to get on to the next thing in my day. And that's a challenge because you can't quite figure out, like you kind of want like a bug report for all of these different things, right? And because a lot of the data viz pieces can be like these little decisions that people make day to day and project to project, I have found it hard to like get that feedback. And I'll say, like, I built a little Excel add-in for our organization so that people would just grab it, they could install it, they click a button and it just styles the graph I mean, it doesn't just, but it like gets you like 90% of the way there. And, you know, it's in a particular location on our intranet. There's a written document that shows you how to install it, how to use it. I made an internal video that walks people through, and I still get people emailing me like, where do I get it? And how do I install it? And how do I use it? It's like I can't like, do you want me to like come by your house? Well, now come by your house and like walk you through it, because I'll do that, but like that doesn't seem efficient on anybody's part. So there's just a lot of hand holding, I think. And I think, to Alan's point earlier of like, maybe it was Max's point about like keeping it as a living document. Like, I think that's just so important to say. And also maybe just couching it in terms of like, we don't necessarily know all the right answers. Like, we have experience and we think that, you know, having a pie chart of more than X slices is not a good idea. But if you could convince us otherwise, you won't be able to. But if you could convince us otherwise, we're open to that, and we can revise the guide.
I think there's a way to build into guidelines, sort of in that like checklist process of like, does this meet our standards? Does this make sense? Is sort of that first step. Like, am I using the right chart type? And can someone who is not as intimately familiar with the chart and the data that goes in it understand what I've done? I feel like we can sometimes get too much into our own holes, and we're just like, oh yeah, it looks good, it has the right colors, we're done. But having that check of understanding, both for ourselves and then for someone else who hasn't seen it and hasn't worked with it, is a good first low-hanging usability step that we can implement. And that's a great place to do it, is in style guides. It's not full user testing, but it's getting there.
Yeah, I would also say that part of it is emphasizing to people how important data visualization is to the final product. I mean, so if you work in a place like I do, where people really value the data and the analysis and the scientific method and the writing, just emphasizing that the graphs are such an important part of that entire communication effort, right? That we're not just throwing graphs in the report because we just need to, we need a figure one because we just need to have one. That is important to the argument. It's important to the story. And it's important for how people are going to take your report, use your report, be, engaged to look in the report or the document, whatever it is. And so I think part of this is just emphasizing the importance of data visualization in organizations where maybe it hasn't really been adopted yet. And that sort of goes off on a different discussion that would be another fun lunchtime conversation to have, like how do you get people to adopt it? But I think that's all, it's all part of it together, is getting people to understand its value. And then once you understand the value, how do we make it consistent? How do we make it really good?
And as a sanity check, I think it's useful to actually do user testing. And so I've gotten a bunch of people from customer success in a Zoom and just had them use it, comment on it. And that was great. I've done stuff like that several times. I've also used Google Forms. Not that many people fill them out, but whatever input you can get is great for those who want to do it async.
What sorts of changes did you have come out of that user testing session, Max?
So the one in particular that I'm thinking of that was with customer success, that was mostly about understanding if the charts were what they wanted, because I was designing dashboards for them and about interaction, what information was necessary and how the flow was for them. Because this was also in the stage where I was trying to figure out what charts we use, how should dashboards be, what should the information architecture be of the dashboards, how are the end users going to be using it? Because although you're designing for the data visualization developers, I mean, really, you're also designing for the end user. And so you have to make sure it satisfies what they want. So I guess this was not user testing for people who are making dashboards, but people who are using them to make sure that what I was doing was effective for my stakeholders and not just what I thought was awesome work.
So Max, can you talk, I mean, every time I talk to someone who does like user testing and UX design, they're just like, you just literally sit people down and talk to them and just like, I mean, the what is the famous book is like, Don't Make Me Think, right? Like, it's just like kind of almost common sense. But like, is that your approach to user testing? Is like, just sit down, make a graph with, here's a thing. I want you to make this graph, whatever, following these guidelines, and I'm just going to watch you and sort of pepper you with questions.
I didn't do that kind of user testing, but I think that's a great idea, and that's how I would do it, because I usually don't like to give context, just like throw them in, as you said, and then see what they do. Because like by giving context, I mean, you'd have to make sure that they would already have that context before, and you're just giving it to the recording, because otherwise you could be kind of like cheating in a way, or giving them more information than they would have in reality. So yes, I like that approach.
Yeah, I agree. I think there's lots of different ways to do it. They can be everything from like, a full week shadow program where you're just like following every nuance of their job and trying to understand what it is they do, to, a 5-minute user test on like a testing website, like usertesting.com. So it really just depends on what kind of information you're looking to gather. But at the end of the day, you're just trying to understand what they don't, where things are working and where they're not.
And this goes to like the continuous, the fact that these are living documents too, right? Like just because you didn't do user testing at the beginning, you can do user testing now, both on like the guide itself of how people are using it and implementing it. And maybe you need to add more language here to explain this thing, or the charts itself that are being styled by the guide. Do people understand them? Do we have readability issues? Should we make sure that our headlines have alignment and are more prescriptive? Because people are like, oh yeah, bar chart of X, that's not helpful to me, right? I don't know what's going on here.
But one quick thing on that is, one of the best ways to give feedback is to start with an opinion, right? If you ask people what they think about, what do you think about our color scales? They'll be like, oh, they're fine, whatever. But if you say, all right, you have to use the color scale, and this is the color scale, they're going to point out everything that's wrong with it. And so even though it's putting yourself out there a little bit, just get comfortable with taking those sort of risks, because it's one of the best ways to draw in that feedback and drive the discussion.
So one more question as we're winding up here is, where should a style guide live?
So this gets back to one of the things John was touching on, like people still just don't know where to find it. One thing we've done is we have a dedicated URL. So, and it's like really like, so our design system is called Spectrum, and the URL for Spectrum is spectrum.adobe.com. And anyone can go and look at it really easily. And so as long as you can remember the name of our design system, you can find the style guides for it. And from there, it links out to all the other related resources and libraries. So we've had a lot of success with that. Now, there are people that haven't heard of the design system. And for those people, it doesn't, we still have to reach out to them and make sure they know, but it's caught on really quickly, and we don't have very many questions on where to find it these days.
I think for Spectrum, it's helpful that it's also public.
That was the other point. Yeah. Right. So
yeah. We have an internal one as well. It has, a few more characters. Spectrum is on the corporate website, but it's the same content. It's published in the same repository.
One of the other advantages of keeping it public And we've actually talked about this too. So our current style guide is public. It's on our GitHub, and like anyone can go grab it. And we've talked about having, for the future, having sort of a public one and a private one, where the private one would have, some other related elements that you would need for like your graph. So I can't remember exactly, but we talked about like maybe there'd be a link to our like our IRB process would be within our particular style guide, and like some internal themes and tools that are not yet public. But there's a lot of value, I think, to having something that's public, so that you can get feedback, you can draw on what other people have. It does make it easier, I think, for people to find things. Like, I don't know why, but like telling people to go to this part of the internet seems so difficult, but just giving people a URL to like blah 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 styleguide.john.com is like super easy. I don't know why those two things are so difficult, but like I think transparency in general is sort of a good thing.
Yeah, on that note, like we really encourage contributions as well, right? So if people have a suggestion, we want to know about it, even stuff that goes beyond feedback, right? If they found some accessibility shortcoming and a way to fix it, we want to know about that. And we encourage a lot of contributions, and we get some really good ones too. Another advantage of it being open source, like Amy mentioned.
I think there's a way to do both public and private that John sort of was talking about, is that you have the style guide be public, but you have more of those like internal resources and templates linked, but they're behind a login system, right? You need to have an Urban login to get to this Google document that tells you the IRB process, or you need to have to be logged in to get the link to the template. I think there's a lot of organizational concern that just because this thing is public, people are going to like rip off our charts and make charts that are Adobe branded and say these are from Adobe, but they're actually not. I have not seen that as come to fruition. I think I've used public, or I've had data visualization style guidelines be public for at least 7 years, and I've never seen anyone masquerade charts as being from my organization when they were not.
Yeah, I think the opposite is more. I don't know if it's the opposite actually, but I think like I always hear the case of like people want to have their logos on their slides all the time. They want to have like, I was just working on one this morning that's like, it literally takes up a quarter of the slide is this like huge logo banner at the bottom. And the argument for keeping it is like, well, if someone takes our slides and they post it on their blog and they steal it and they post it on their blog, we want everyone to know that it's our slide. And I'm like, if they're stealing your content, they're going to cut off the logo. Like, I mean, so yeah, I agree with you, Amy. I haven't seen anybody like, and it's a rare case. And if that's going to happen, then you just fight the good fight. But I haven't ever seen something like that happen.
If it's going to happen, they're going to like use an eyedropper to pick up our colors anyways, and like you can get font matching. Like, I don't think that that's the case. I think there's a big argument to be made for the fact that it like contributes back to the community and it helps other people, figure out what are best practices and have this repository of them. Again, on the Data Visualization Society website, there's under resources, there's a list of data visualization style guidelines that you can view and add to.
And so you all think that by having a public style guide, that increases visibility also to your company and the people who are going to be using it?
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends on your organization and a lot of things. I mean, sometimes just the organizational politics of having something like that public are just not worth the benefit. But yeah, the point I was trying to make is just make it as easy, as simple and memorable as possible.
I think it also makes the case of our organization cares about this thing so much that these are our guidelines for doing it, and we are proud of these guidelines, and we're going to show them off. They're going to be public. This is how much we care about this particular thing.
It almost create some sort of accountability as well, because if it's public, then people can see if I don't know, if you do like customer facing or public data visualizations, then people would be able to see if it didn't cover your style guide. I mean, not like hopefully there's not going to be people who are studying your style guide and then like seeing where you've messed up, but it could create that idea of accountability.
Yeah. We have a couple more minutes here, so we're going to wrap up. I'm going to pop to each of you just for one tip for people for creating data visualization style guidelines. It could be one thing to start with or one thing to think about, but one tip from each of us as we wrap up.
I can start. I would say to survey your data visualization landscape. So collect, feedback about what it's like and get to understand your users, not only who is making the data visualizations, but who is using them or who are using them, and then also the tools that are involved, because all of that is important and is going to drive the decision of what should be included and how you should go about the whole process.
Do I have to go next? This is hard because we covered a lot. I just want to pull the "it depends" thing. I think I guess I would go back to the theme that we've been talking about, which is treat it as a living document. So this is where I'll just say, like, personally, this is where we are I am sort of stumbling on our revision of our style guide, that we've done so much more expansion that we're just sort of like stuck in the weeds and we can't sort of move forward. So if you're starting from scratch, go to, as just one example, go to the style guides website. There's a whole library of style guides in there. Peek around at a few, see how people are sort of setting it up. And at the very minimum, start with color and font and, and just the basics of the chart, and just start there and give people at least that beginning part of it. And then as you treat it, if you can treat it as a living thing, then you can build up from there. But at least sort of like, launch that first, I don't know, I'm failing on my metaphors today, but like, put that first thing out there and get started. And I think once I'll just say this one other thing, which leads to our next lunchtime conversation that we'll have on like, how do you get people to embrace good data viz? Once people start to use those branding guidelines and see that there's advantages to that, and their stuff gets picked up more and it's more consistent, it's showing up on Twitter and other places, other people will start to embrace that idea that this is good to have consistency, and it's good to make it look good and match the organization's styles. And so if you can sort of start small, get a few small wins by just the basic pieces, then it'll be, I think, easier to build up and get more of the buy-in from the organization. I hope.
All right, mine's going to be super specific, and it has to do with color. Don't treat color as a monolith. You need to address the problems of sequential color in a visualization separately from categorical color, and hopefully address divergent color as well. But don't try and create one color system that addresses all of them. If you've been around data viz a while, you know this. This is not new information, but it's one of the mistakes I see a lot of beginners make, is not understanding the distinction and the proper use of those 2-3 different color scales.
I think my concluding tip is think about education and why this is useful for people, and continuing to talk about it and not just treat it as a checkbox that you've done and put it on a shelf somewhere and think that people will use it. So trying to iterate and continue to talk about it. Okay. Thank you so much, Alan, Max, and John, for joining me today and talking about data visualization style guidelines.
Anytime.
Right.
Thanks, Amy.
Thank
Have a
you.
good day.